Hello and welcome to Government 101. I'm Eileen Preston. Our guest here today is like a national treasure, like the national seashore for Cape Cod. He's got an encyclopedic knowledge of all Cape Cod issues, been a county commissioner, been a select board member, a town manager, aide to not one, but two U.S. representatives to Congress. He is none other than Mark Forrest. Thanks for being here, Mark.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to see you.
It's great to be here with you in 2025. We've got a whole new year coming up.
I know.
A very interesting year. Donald Trump has taken over, and he's changed a lot very, very quickly. So I'm wondering if we can start off talking about funding, because things seem to be contracting in some ways. How is Cape Cod going to respond to this?
Yeah.
Can I start you off maybe with the funding of the bridges and?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk a little bit about, with this new administration, what does it all mean for Cape Cod? Because this is the question that I get asked all the time, from one town to the next. And usually there's some local project or some initiative that people really care about, and they're worried, well, is this project going to continue to go forward? What are the odds of that happening? And obviously with this new administration, President Trump and his entourage, they not only have the White House, but his allies have the control of the Congress. And so clearly they're controlling the purse strings of the federal government. And they're exercising control through a whole series of executive orders. It's almost impossible to keep up with them. It is. It's dizzying. Yeah. It's complicating. People are just sort of overwhelmed. And just when you think you've figured it out, all of a sudden there's another new set of initiatives. The president's advisor, Mr. Bannon, called it flooding the zone.
It's deliberate.
It's deliberate. It is. It's a very deliberate approach. Some call it shock and awe. Whatever it is, it's become a real challenge for the American people, particularly people in our neck of the woods, to really follow and keep up with what's going on. So the question that keeps coming up is what does it mean for us? And funding is obviously the big factor, because there's some programs that are being eliminated at the federal government. There's some dollars that are being clawed back at the federal government. I think it's important for people to understand that this new administration and their allies in Congress, what they're trying to do is put together another tax package and get that through the Congress. So in order for that to work, this happened the last time in 2016 when Mr. Trump came in. The Republicans came together with the administration to figure out where can they find savings. So what that means is cutting a whole array of programs, coming up with as much in terms of savings, because within the Republican Party, there are going to be those somewhat reluctant to get behind tax cuts because they'll be concerned about the deficits. So they're going to want to see huge spending cuts to go along with the proposed tax cuts, which will be significant and will sort of make all sorts of problems in terms of the deficit. And then there's the issue of the equity, right? The equity of the tax cuts. Who's ultimately going to benefit? Obviously, the vast majority of the benefits will be going to the most wealthy, the billionaire class, so to speak, and very little of it will come our way. And the reality is that many of the programs that are being cut are typically programs and services that are pretty much beneficial to low and moderate income people, the working class, the middle class. And so that's kind of the sort of, from a big picture point of view, what's going on. Now, here on Cape Cod, we've had some major initiatives, some major projects. One of the biggest ones is obviously the replacement of the bridges, Cape Cod Canal. When the new administration, began to take office, myself as a county commissioner, my fellow commissioners, we had a direct outreach to the governor's office to find out whether or not all the grant agreements for the funding, the $2.1 billion Sagamore Bridge replacement project, all that funding was in place. We've been told that as of today, the grant agreements have been signed. There was some delay in getting those signed, but the grant agreements have been signed. They're pretty confident that the funding has been secured. And so far, the Sagamore Bridge project is still moving along at the pace that it was moving along before, which is good, because Governor Healy and her team have done an outstanding job in moving that project along. The challenge has always been, once the funding was locked down for the Sagamore Bridge replacement, making sure that we had a handle on funding options and funding opportunities for the Bourne Bridge. The good thing is that with the Bourne Bridge, the funding programs that are in place to help get that project off the ground at the moment, those funding programs are still there.
There's state money, is that why?
Well, no, we're talking about the federal the federal program.
Okay.
The state is putting money on the table for the Bourne Bridge. So what I anticipate happening is later on this spring, after the president's budget comes out, we're going to see the state of Massachusetts apply for funds to implement and move forward with the new Bourne Bridge.
$2.5 billion, a little
Correct.
bit more expensive
Correct.
than the Sagamore.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we're a little bit concerned about the prospects given the changes in administration. So I think to some degree, the commissioners and others here on the Cape will be advocating that the administration at least use its own funds to advance the design work on that project because there's just so much work that has to be done. There's no need to sort of pause any of that work. The administration has committed funds to do that project, so it's a question of whether or not we can sustain the momentum on it. And by the time we get further along in the design process for the Bourne project, there'll be a new administration in office and hopefully a continued recognition on the importance of funding for this. So I'm still confident that we're going to get both bridges done. This is, we've had situations like this happen before. I can remember when Newt Gingrich was elected speaker and we had the contract
with America.
Exactly, the contract, and there were huge funding cuts that came back at that time. I was in the middle of trying to figure out how we're going to clean up the pollution at the military base here on the Upper Cape, and we figured out a way to get through that. So I'm confident that we can weather this storm. It won't be easy. It'll be challenging. We'll be, probably racking our brains out from time to time, but I think we can work our way through it.
So the design will take about 4 years for the Bourne Bridge, and by then you think the Trump administration might be done and we can move on again.
Yeah.
It's okay. That's interesting.
So, but there are other initiatives that are funded. We've seen a lot of environmental funding come to the Cape, or at least commitments for environmental projects, environmental restoration work, particularly.
Okay.
We've done, obviously, with my other hat being with the Cape Cod Conservation District, we've helped fund the Coonamessett River project.
Definitely want to talk about that because that's right here in Falmouth, and it was so almost done, and now there's been a federal freeze, right?
Correct.
So, and that project came in, Betsy Gladfelter did it. Most of the viewers know her. Dr. Gladfelter's been working forever on that project, and the herring were going to come back. There were about 4 or 5 different species of fish.
Yeah.
Plant life is really, on the lower Coonamessett, was immensely impacted, very nicely. So, federal funding freeze.
Well, I'm very involved in the project. As the chairman of the Cape Cod Conservation District, we're involved in helping steer federal funding from other programs to that project. So we've been a partner all along. We're very excited about it. It's a terrific project. And with respect to the funding that's been allocated, or at least designated for this project, there's a lot to be concerned about, because right now this freeze, we're concerned it might be permanent, and it may be part of a bucket of funding that could be clawed back and utilized, as I said, as part of the big picture to identify funds that could be set aside to offset some of the tax cuts. So I think that's something that we're going to have to work extra hard in terms of securing. The good thing, though, is that we're at a point right now in terms of the Cape's history where the alphabet soup of restoration funding programs has become there's just so many programs now. I can recall 20 years ago when it was just a handful, like 2 or 3 programs, but now there are so many. My hope is that we can patch together funding from a variety of other sources so that if we lose funding in that project, we're in a position where we can make that up. And I'm certainly going to be available to Betsy and the rest of the team that she's assembled that work on that project to help them figure out a way to work through this.
Yeah, they'll be glad to hear that, I'm sure. So when we hear freeze, a freeze doesn't mean just hold in place. It can mean an actual take back of the money that was promised. It can be a complete bottoming out of the money. So what about tariffs? That's another sort of Trump idea. How will that affect the Cape?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the tariffs that are being that have been levied. At the moment, they're suspended. So as we're doing this interview, the tariffs for Canada have been suspended.
Right.
They're talking about 25% tariffs on goods and services, or goods particularly coming into the United States. It's important to step back and look at what we depend on the Canadians for. The Canadians provide an enormous amount of energy.
Hydropower.
Hydropower
Yeah.
from Quebec is an incredibly important resource. It's clean, it's inexpensive. I mean, it's rare to find clean, inexpensive, renewable energy in New England, but that's where we get the bulk of it. And then you have, obviously, a fairly steady supply of lumber that comes in from Canada into New England. So the tariff impacts could be significant in terms of increases in energy and electricity,
Yes.
As well as increases in the cost of building a home. And those are really, really critical areas here, because energy costs continue to go up. Families here on the Cape and elsewhere are really getting hit hard with increases in electricity and energy costs. And then, and our programs, the way we're set up is we don't provide nearly enough help for folks, that really need assistance in paying their bills to keep the lights on, keep the heat on. And then obviously housing, increases in the cost of lumber are a real problem, and will continue to make housing even further out of reach of most folks here in the Cape.
Yeah, and when you talk about funding and how expensive things are going to get, and you think about energy prices, so many people on Cape Cod are paycheck to paycheck. I mean, there's a lot of fixed income, right? We have an older population, so this is really going to hit us hard.
Yes. There is a perception, in Washington and on Beacon Hill that the Cape is like the land of the rich, but the reality is that we have a fairly high percentage of people living on fixed income. Our median family income is lower than the state average, and so many programs are, based on, providing assistance on wealth, and wealth is often determined as our property values. We put so much credence in looking at property values to determine a community's wealth, when in fact we really should be paying really close attention to what the average income is in an area. It is. So that gets lost. But in any event, the tariffs themselves could be a real challenge in terms of energy costs and housing costs.
And when you think about energy, South Coast Wind got its permit, and yet wind projects may not be something the Trump administration wants to start at all. So
my assessment is that the wind, unless offshore wind energy project was leased and set up, it's not going to happen.
Dead in the water.
Yeah, I think many projects are dead in the water, because what the administration is going to do is they're going to, I think, this is not rocket science. In cutting the funding for offshore wind energy, they're going to basically, in this new tax package, make sure that any credits, any financial assistance, tax breaks for those developing these projects, those are gone. And they have pretty strong support for doing that. So, and it's those tax credits that basically have attracted the investment. So the large banks, the large investors that are putting money into these projects, they're counting on those tax credits. And if those tax credits terminate, then it's going to be, you're just not going to be able to get a project off the ground. So between the tax credits and putting into the regulatory agencies or the oversight agencies, now there's this federal agency called the Bureau of Energy Management. They handle offshore energy projects. We call them BOEM. That's the name we give this group. And this is today's version of the old Minerals Management Service that used to oversee offshore oil drilling in this country. They have a broader mandate now, offshore wind. And this group is going to be led by individuals who are not real supporters of offshore wind. So let's assume you're associated with a company or a project that is already in place, that's already there. You've got windmills that are operating. I think it's going to be very difficult to get quick approvals on changes in construction, modifications to your project. I think the agency has the ability to really make it difficult to sustain momentum in operating these projects. So if you have a project that's up and running, you're not going to have the most cooperative people in the world to deal with in terms of the oversight and regulation of your offshore wind farm.
So with the tightening and contraction, the governor has to make some state decisions as well. So she recently did her budget for 2025. And there was a closing for the only psychiatric hospital here on the Cape, which is in Pocasset, a mental health hospital with 16 beds, I believe. And I've heard 78 employees, I've heard 56. It's a good number of people work there. Can you talk about that and how the county commissioners are thinking about that?
Sure, we're very concerned about it. We had a meeting this week in which we brought in a number of officials to sort of update us on what's going on first, and then what the impacts might be. So in terms of what's going on, obviously in the governor's proposal that's been presented to the legislature, that facility's slated to be shut. There are, from what we understand, 17 beds, but the capacity of that clinic is a little bit in dispute. Our sources suggest that you could treat and serve upwards between 30 to 50 people there, and there are 79 employees there. You're right, the governor has some challenges because with this new administration and this new Congress, the type of help and resistance that we rely upon from the federal government is going to be constrained. Many of these services require federal Medicaid funding, and the federal government is not likely to be as generous or as robust in terms of Medicaid funding as they have been in the past. This is this Congress and this administration, is looking for places to cut, and Medicaid is sort of number one on the list of places to cut. So for the Commonwealth, we rely on a fairly significant amount of federal Medicaid funding, and the only way we're going to be able to figure out how to keep this clinic open is if there's a way to bring in other state dollars to help augment what we might be losing in Medicaid funding. So that's something that we have to work together with our legislative delegation, our legislators here on the Cape. They've been terrific on this, and we've got to work with them as well as engaging the administration. So the commissioners have offered to bring our providers and stakeholders to the table to better understand the impacts and help them better understand how difficult this is for Cape Cod. This is an area where already the community constituent groups have been fairly vocal in their opposition to this.
We got a letter from the Barnstable Sheriff's Office, and Sheriff Buckley was upset. She says how important these mental health hospitals are for police. And I think the second cause of death for kids 15 to 24 is suicide.
Right.
Mental health is such a crisis, and drugs are such a crisis. They're kind of combined.
Well, we did a comprehensive assessment looking at the sort of the state of Cape Cod today in terms of the need for these services. We just finished that up last year, and we, I think, have a pretty good handle on how serious the situation has become. And that's one of the reasons why we're strongly opposed to the changes that are being proposed. So there's also been a reduction in case managers in this area. So we're going in the wrong direction. But again, it's important to understand that the pressures that the governor and the legislature are having to wrestle with are basically pressures put on them at the federal level. If the federal government wasn't telegraphing to us, the significant cuts they're talking about, then we'd be having a different conversation today. But this is what she's faced with. She also has to realize, she's realizing, and in her budget, she's dealing with cuts in other areas. This isn't the only place that's being singled out. There are other areas as well that are getting impacted. So we're getting mobilized. We're bringing people together. We want a seat at the table. We think it's important for this administration to understand how dependent we are on these services. And I think we need to be open to figuring out how we can serve this constituency and how to serve people. If there are other options, we want to come to the table fully cooperative in finding ways where we can help people, but we need to help people. And the
Yeah.
best way to do it is the way we're doing it now.
Yeah.
But, like I said, we're prepared to come to the table and
Make some compromises if
If-
needed. That
if
is
we
the
can.
game of politics, right? You need to, give
Well,
and
we have
take.
to also, quite frankly, be prepared that if the legislature doesn't give us the funding to sustain this, we've got to be prepared with a plan B.
Yeah, yeah. So those are challenges, but you met one challenge, and I want to congratulate you on that because the Joint Base Machine Gun Range
Yes.
was put away. The governor agreed with you that that was a bad idea to put a machine gun range on top of the Sangamore Lens, which means you get to move forward now with, I guess there's a new master plan, is there not, for a joint base?
Exactly. Yeah.
What, do you do it every 20 years or 10 years, or how does that work?
Let me see if I can.
Give me a historical
First of all,
context.
on the machine gun range,
Yes.
I appreciate your comments. We worked very hard on that, and we were making a very strong environmental argument, public health argument, but also a legal argument that the range should not be there. I think everyone understands the environmental wisdom of not putting a machine gun range on top of the most critical part of your watershed
Drinking
or water
water,
supply. I think
yeah.
here on Cape Cod, just about everybody gets that. A project like this would not be allowed in the Quabbin Quabbin Reservoir
Right.
watershed. There are other watersheds where the project like this would not be allowed. So we believe that this watershed deserves the same protection. So that's kind of a no-brainer on Cape Cod. The legal arguments, we really, I think, honed a very strong legal case that what was being proposed was inconsistent with the requirements associated with the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve. This area is a water supply reserve. It was designated as such in 2001, and it was established to protect Cape Cod's water supplies because training at the base was having an adverse impact on the water supplies of all the towns surrounding the base. So back when we worked on this initiative in creating the reserve, we started working on that in about 1999 when Congressman Delahunt was in office and I was on his staff. We made the proposal that this land needed to be set aside because we were losing water supplies sort of down gradient of the base at a faster clip than we were getting new water supplies and new water resources. And the pump and treat systems were not working or coming online fast enough to deal with the remediation. So we had a real crisis on our hands back then. So we reached an agreement with the Pentagon that we would utilize a portion of the base, all right, to develop new water supplies for the communities as well as for the military. We would identify areas that were safe, that were clean, and then we would protect those areas. And then over time, as other areas got cleaned up, they would be available as well. So that was the arrangement. So this reserve was established as a reserve for the towns. One, to replace water supplies that were being lost, but also to deal with future demands and future needs here on Cape Cod. And as I've said before, the Sagamore Lens is a massive underground water reservoir that feeds and supplies not just the 4 Upper Cape towns, but it also is a resource for Barnstable in Yarmouth. And out of that controversy, the governor agreed with us.
Right.
And basically came to the conclusion that they were not going to sort of allow the project to go forward. We were at a deadline, the end of September. A decision had to be made to award a contract. The governor said no, and then agreed to work with the Guard to find other ways to deal with their training needs in other, portions of the Commonwealth. There is a similar range being built, at Fort Devens. So there's no reason why an arrangement can't be made to do that. That was a relatively, recent development, but I think it's a positive one that helps us out here. Now, the reason why the master plan fits into this conversation is because years ago, the idea for the reserve actually came out of a master planning study.
Okay.
The last major master plan that we did on the base, on Joint Base Cape Cod, was done in 1998.
Okay.
And in that master plan, they mapped out all the critical environmental resource areas, where the key wetlands areas were, where the key wildlife habitat was, and then identified where the key water resources, they were identified. And that's why once the plan was released, it identified improvements that could be made in the industrial area, the cantonment area, that southern 5,000 acres.
Right.
And, what we should do with respect to the northern part. And that's where Congressman Delahunt led the charge to create the reserve. And then that was one of my projects when I was on the congressman's staff. So here we are today. It's a different situation
So
now.
why are you revisiting the master plan? Is that just because after 30 years you revisit something, or?
Well, that master plan was very useful in making a whole host of decisions, but what happened is time has changed, and things have changed out at the military base.
Right.
The jets are no longer there,
That's right.
and that master plan sort of presumed the jets would continue to be there. And there are portions of the base that the National Guard has no use for. So what we've recommended is that it's now time after 30 years or so that we get back to the table and update the master plan.
And when you say we recommend that you update it, who are the we?
The we, that's a very good point. When the last master plan was done, it was the military coming to the table with the Cape Cod Commission, as well as representatives from the towns and from the citizenry at large, particularly here on the Upper Cape.
All righty.
So there was a community working group or an advisory group that sat at the table and that provided input to those working on creating this master plan vision. What we needed to have back in 1998 is a consensus vision on the future of the installation so that it could survive into the future. And let's not forget that back in 1998, there was a tremendous amount of controversy about the installation because the cleanup was not going as well as we had hoped back then. Now, things have certainly turned around and gotten much better. But back then, there was some real anger and concern in the community that maybe the base needed to be shut down because of so much mismanagement in terms of the environment out there.
Yeah.
So then Congressman Delahunt, that's one of the reasons why he both pioneered the work on the reserve, but he also was instrumental in getting the master planning process because he knew that base closures were coming up and that if there wasn't a consensus on the future of this installation, the entire base could be closed. So that was the argument that he made back there. It's a relevant argument today. We have still a surplus of military infrastructure here in the United States. The military at some point is going to be looking for support in Congress to downsize even further. We call these downsizing efforts we create these independent commissions called Base Realignment and Closure Commissions, BRACs. And the last one was done in 2005. We survived it back then. Even we were on the list back then, but we survived it because we had a master plan. We had all the planning and all the legwork done to show the utility of the installation. We lost the jets, but we kept the base and we kept an Air National Guard presence out on the base. So here we are today, and we need to be vigilant because there will be attempts to find ways to shrink military infrastructure. So we need to get ahead of the game.
Yeah, get a little defensive on that, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So we need
So
to.
the same groups of people will work on the master plan together. Is that right?
Well, there'll be some different. There'll be some different players at the table. One of the new players is mass development. Mass development is a quasi-public state agency that develops property that's owned by the state. Mass development used to be called the Massachusetts Land Bank.
Okay.
And back when, I hate to date myself, but back when Mike Dukakis was governor and we were dealing with military base closures, they were assigned to help redevelop military bases. All right, so they're very well versed in military bases and finding ways to keep them alive or help them survive. Now they're responsible for the oversight of the Fort Devens, and they have been very successful in creating a viable military training area, while at the same time a community with housing and other industrial tenants that are very compatible with military training. But they've been able to create a model environment that I think is a very successful one, and it's perhaps there's some lessons that we can learn from Devens in terms of the future viability and strength here out at Joint Base Cape Cod.
So you'd like to see some housing there?
Well, we need housing. The military needs housing. The Coast Guard needs housing. The allowance.
You're right, actually. The general actually told me he would be very amenable to some housing there.
Well, I think and the commissioners have been incredibly active and vocal on the need for housing for not just the military, but also the Coast Guard.
That's right.
So we have some common interests here. Those that are serving in the Guard actually should have the opportunity to use their housing allowances or whatever allowances they've been provided, but they should be able to use those allowances on affordable base housing. It's done in other areas. We should look at how we can do it here. And we've seen reductions in Coast Guard operations because of the lack of housing. So if we want to sustain, an active military base, if we want to sustain a Coast Guard presence here, and I think we've worked out, an arrangement on that everyone's comfortable with, then what we need to do is figure out how we tackle the housing problem together.
So just a little bit more on the master plan. When do you expect it to begin?
Well, right now, Mass Development they've issued an RFP, a request for proposals. They're looking for consultants to work with them and doing this master planning work. They expect to get their responses relatively shortly. I suspect by April or May we'll have a consultant on board, and we'll be convening community meetings probably soon thereafter, starting late spring, early summer.
Right. A little bit more about the Affordable Homes Act.
Yes.
We're going to switch a little bit. The National Seashore. I referred you as the National Seashore. You're a gem.
Yeah, well, you're very kind.
You're a crown.
You're very kind.
Explain to the folks, the Affordable Homes Act is for ADU,
right,
accessory dwelling units, and when that act was made, they seem to have forgotten that we have a national seashore. So that makes it threatens the national seashore by maybe someone's going to put a condo on Cahoon's Hollow Beach. I don't know, but so what's happening?
What's going on there? You're always picking the complicated issues to talk about. Let me see if I can sort of explain this in very simple terms. You have to start at the beginning of the Cape Cod National Seashore when it was created.
Yeah.
Back when it was created, the decision was, the law basically allows for people who own property in the seashore to continue to have their homes. So if you built your home in the Cape Cod National Seashore, there was a magic date of 1950, there was September 1959. Yeah. I forget the exact date, but there was a magic date. If you built your house before that date, you could keep it. But after that date, and the date was key because that's when the Seashore Act was being contemplated, and there was a real concern that people would rush to develop the seashore while the Seashore Act was being contemplated.
Sure, yeah.
So the drafters of the legislation wanted it abundantly clear that as of the date they more or less dropped the bill, that there would be any construction that happened there after that date would be basically condemned and acquired by the federal government. So when we create a national park, the normal practice is to acquire all the property. But the seashore we decided not to. All right. The federal law allows people that built before that date to keep their property.
Not expand the footprint.
Exactly, but that's just it. There were conditions on it. The conditions on the continued use of the property, your home, within the Cape Cod National Seashore is that you can't expand it beyond, and this is the sort of the key criteria. You can't expand it in a way that's inconsistent with the Secretary of Interior's standards for construction within the Cape Cod National Seashore. So there's a very specific set of standards that limit development on existing properties within the national park. Now, if you as a homeowner violated those standards, let's say you made a significant expansion on your property, you would be subject to condemnation. So the promise that was made early under the Act to continue to keep your property, that everyone was on notice that if you violated that, your property could be condemned and acquired by the federal government. So this is where the ADU issue pops up.
Well, when the secretaries change with each administration, doesn't the
standards change?
Exactly.
The standards pretty much are the same.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, these are standards put together by park lawyers and and bureaucrats that basically really, it's almost like a historic preservation district. You're limiting, significantly limiting the kind of development. The whole purpose of creating the Cape Cod National Seashore was to preserve Cape Cod at a particular point in time.
Keep it wild, yeah.
Exactly. And to limit development within the park.
So now the ADU with the affordable.
Right. So the ADU,
Act.
the Affordable Housing Act, essentially allows by right the ability of a homeowner to actually build an ADU.
Yeah.
All right, an accessory dwelling unit in their property. However, in the Cape Cod National Seashore, if you're a homeowner and you attempt to do it, you most likely will be breaking the federal law and the federal guidelines, putting your property in jeopardy. All right, so we don't want to see people wanting to take advantage of the ADU and finding their property in jeopardy. So some kind of relief needs to be created to deal with that problem. And it could very well be that under state law, the by right to do the ADU may be conditioned. You know, you can do it provided whatever you're doing is consistent with the Secretary's standards. So something's got to be done there to fix that. Otherwise, some people who would like to build an ADU if they own a home within the Cape Cod National Seashore might find themselves exposing themselves to some condemnation by the federal government.
Okay. See, I thought you were going to say that they were going to be able to stop people who own on the National Seashore from building an ADU, but it doesn't sound like you think they should be stopped. I'm afraid everybody's going to build a second house on their lawn.
Again, the limitations on development are strict. If
you're not concerned because of the limitations.
The limitations are very, very strict. Just because the law was, I believe that if someone tries to build a conventional accessory dwelling unit on a home within the Cape Cod National Seashore, they're going to run into trouble.
Okay.
So I'm not suggesting, the state of Massachusetts can't provide that relief. The federal government's the only one that could basically allow them to do something. But the thing is, the federal government's not going to provide that relief for homeowners. Homeowners are going to have to continue to basically maintain their homes in a way that's consistent with those federal standards. Okay. I know this is very complicated stuff, but it's a very complicated federal statute, and these provisions are very complicated. But what we want to be able to do is rather than each town have to try to wrestle with this problem, we would just like to find some easy fix so that for those that own homes within the Cape Cod National Seashore, maybe they don't have the right to have, the right to do an ADU would be conditioned.
Okay.
All right? It's conditioned, and it acknowledges the existence of these other strict standards. Okay. All right?
Yeah.
So it creates a fair warning system that if you go beyond what's allowed, you could be in trouble.
Okay.
Does that help?
It does help. Okay, so you've been very generous with your time, but I do want to do a quick round table with you. I just want quick answers to these questions, okay?
Yeses and nos, okay.
Okay. What was your favorite project you've worked on?
Oh my God, favorite project?
Yeah.
Over the years? Well, I've been very lucky to have worked with 2 congressmen and working in the manager's office in Provincetown. My most favorite project actually was not in the congressional offices. My favorite project was when I was in the manager's office, town manager's office in Provincetown.
Yeah.
I worked on the redevelopment of McMillan Pier, and I had to work with the fishing industry. We, at the time, this was early 1980s, 1980, 81. Back then, we had a very large fishing fleet. Provincetown was still dominated by a Portuguese fishing community. It's dramatically changed now, but back then, it was not just the project, but also the time and place, being in Provincetown as a manager at that time. And it wasn't just the project, but it was also the people. I had to get to know the fishermen in Provincetown. I had to understand how they fished, how they operated, how they worked, because if we're going to redevelop a pier...
That is kind of fascinating, actually.
It was. Yeah. It was unbelievable.
And free fish, probably. A little lobster every once in a while?
Every now and then I could look in the back of my truck or in the back of my sedan, depending on what I was driving that day, and sometimes somebody would leave me something.
Awesome.
I'd never ask for it, but every now and then. And the reality is
What a tough job, yeah.
But it was a very challenging project and at a very challenging time, and I got to really enjoy the community and meet a lot of wonderful people. Provincetown, I feel that still there's a piece of me that's still there.
That's awesome. Okay, toughest battle.
Toughest battle was fighting to get the cleanup of the Mass Military Reservation.
Okay, yeah, that
All
makes
right.
sense. What do you do when you get discouraged?
What do I do to get discouraged?
When you get discouraged, what do you do?
I don't get discouraged that easily.
Okay.
You know, it's a question of just recharging the batteries and then retooling. I think I learned over the years that if there's something important enough to fight for, you just have to you just have to be persistent, and you just have to find other ways to get at it and to do it. So I don't get discouraged that often.
Okay, last one. What do you want your legacy to be? I know
My
you've got
legacy?
years and years to go. We need you around.
Well, I hope when I'm done with my career, I think what's most important is having a family, and I'm very proud of the family that I have. My wife, my kids, they've been incredibly supportive of me, and I think when I'm done, I know that when I'm done doing this work, I would have pretty much, it's like when I played sports. You want to leave everything on the table, right? You don't want to leave anything behind. So I go back to my days playing hockey, playing basketball, playing any sport. You want to just give it your all. And like I said, I've been blessed. We're having worked in Provincetown in the manager's office, worked for 2 congressmen.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot, and I feel that I've got something to give in terms of helping Cape Cod, because we have all these challenges: still the
Yeah.
environment, still erosion, climate change, restoring rivers and estuaries and embayments. There's just so much work to be done that it's difficult for me to sort of let go. So, at some point that'll happen, but at the moment,
Yeah, no. We need you. We need you in the fight.
yeah, thanks.
Mark Forrest, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yep.
Lovely to talk to you always. Thank you all for watching Government 101. We'll see you next time.